Shadow wasn't like the other dogs at Pine Ridge Animal Shelter. By day, the German shepherd lay motionless in his kennel, amber eyes fixed on something no one else could see. But when the old wall clock struck 3 a.m., everything changed. The howl began low, a mournful vibration that crawled up the spine before climbing to a pitch that pierced the Montana night. A sound so primal, so filled with anguish. It awakened something ancient and fearful in anyone who heard it. 8 months, every night, exactly 3 a.m. "I'm sorry, boy," Abby Thornton whispered, sliding the euthanasia paperwork under his kennel door. "We've tried everything." Behind her, the other dogs had begun their nervous whimpering. By morning, 3 more adoption applications would be withdrawn. What Shadow knew, what he had been trying to tell them for 8 long months, would soon change everything they thought they understood about loyalty, grief, and the unyielding bond between a search dog and the lost soul he refuses to abandon. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Abigail "Abby" Thornton hadn't planned on running an animal shelter in her 40s. At 42, the former Army nurse with silver-streaked brown hair carried herself with military posture. But her eyes held the softness of someone who had known profound loss. 6 years ago, her only son, Michael, had been killed in Afghanistan. The emptiness that followed led her to Pine Ridge Animal Shelter, where abandoned creatures filled a small portion of the void his absence left behind. The shelter itself was nothing impressive, a converted warehouse on the outskirts of Pinewood. Montana. Population 214. Concrete floors, chain-link kennels, and the perpetual smell of wet dog and disinfectant. But to Abby, it was sacred ground, a place where second chances were still possible. Jack Reynolds pushed through the staff entrance, stamping snow from his boots. At 58, the former sheriff moved with the careful deliberation of a man who had seen too much. Weathered face, salt and pepper beard, eyes that crinkled at the corners when he rarely smiled. 5 years ago, Jack had lost his daughter Claire to a hiking accident in these same mountains. 3 months after burying his only child, he buried his wife, who died of what locals simply called heartbreak. "Coffee's fresh," Abby called out, not looking up from her paperwork. "Richard's been calling again." Jack grunted. Richard Warner, the 61-year-old businessman who served as shelter director, was the practical voice on their board, the one who talked about tough decisions and financial realities while examining spreadsheets instead of animals. "Shadow had another rough night," Jack said, pouring coffee into a chipped mug with "World's Best Grandpa," faded on the side a cruel joke from the universe, as Claire had died before giving him grandchildren. Down the concrete hallway, in the last kennel on the left, Shadow lay motionless on a worn blue blanket. The 7-year-old German shepherd's coat gleamed with health, but his eyes reflected a haunted weariness. No chip, no collar, when he arrived, just a mysterious past written in his military-precise obedience and the nighttime howling that had made him unadoptable. What nobody at Pine Ridge understood yet was that Shadow's story was inextricably linked to the Granite Pass avalanche that had dominated local headlines 2 winters ago, a tragedy that had claimed multiple lives and left a community in mourning. Abby found herself lingering outside Shadow's kennel longer than usual that morning. Despite 8 months of disrupted sleep and the growing pressure from Richard, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something special about this dog. Unlike the trembling chihuahuas or the boisterous retrievers that filled the other kennels, Shadow possessed a dignity that bordered on human. "You're trying to tell us something, aren't you?" she whispered, pressing her palm against the chain link. Shadow's ears twitched, but his amber eyes remained fixed on the wall. He hadn't eaten his breakfast again. The main door buzzed, signaling a visitor. Unusual for a Tuesday morning in October, when most of Pinewood was busy with the last harvest or preparing for the long winter ahead. "I'll get it," Jack called from the front desk. Abby heard murmured voices, then Jack's heavy footsteps approaching. "Abby, you need to see this." His voice had an urgency she hadn't heard since he'd worn a sheriff's badge. Jack thrust a yellowed newspaper clipping into her hands. The Pinewood Gazette, dated January 17th, 2 years ago. The headline read, "Granite Pass Avalanche Claims 6 Lives, Child Still Missing." But it was the photo beneath that made Abby's breath catch a search and rescue team with a German shepherd that looked remarkably like Shadow. "Could be any shepherd," Abby said, but uncertainty wavered in her voice. "There's more." Jack's eyes were bright with purpose for the first time in months. "Guy up front says he's looking for a dog that belonged to his colleague. Military type. Says the dog's a trained search and rescue specialist." Before Abby could respond, Richard Warner's Mercedes pulled into the gravel parking lot, visible through the front windows. "Perfect timing," she muttered. Richard entered like he owned the place, which, technically, as chairman of the board, he nearly did. His tailored coat and leather gloves marked him as separate from the rural community he served. "Abigail," he nodded curtly, "I trust you've considered our discussion. The board cannot justify keeping an unadoptable animal that's driving away potential forever homes for our other residents. Richard, we have a visitor who... Ms. Thornton." A deep voice interrupted. A tall man with close-cropped dark hair and the unmistakable bearing of military stood in the hallway. Despite civilian clothes, worn jeans, and a flannel jacket, everything about him suggested a soldier. "I'm Mason Cole. I believe you may have my colleague's dog." Richard extended a hand. "Richard Warner, shelter director. We'd be delighted to facilitate an adoption if..." "Not an adoption," Mason corrected. "A recovery. The dog belongs to the Granite Mountain Search and Rescue Unit." At that moment, something extraordinary happened. Shadow, who had been virtually catatonic for months during daylight hours, suddenly stood at attention. His ears pricked forward, and a low whine escaped his throat. Mason turned toward the sound and froze. "Shadow!" The dog's entire demeanor transformed. He pressed against the kennel door, tail sweeping in wide, urgent arcs, eyes alert and focused for the first time since his arrival. "My God," Mason whispered, dropping to one knee. "It really is you." Abby quickly unlocked the kennel. Instead of bolting out as most dogs would, Shadow emerged with discipline, sitting precisely at Mason's side, though his whole body trembled with contained emotion. "You know this dog?" Richard asked, his businessman's instincts sensing complications. "Everyone in Mountain Rescue knew Shadow and Tom," Mason said, ruffling the shepherd's ears with reverent hands. "Best avalanche team in 3 states. But Tom Miller died about 8 months ago, heart attack while hiking. We never knew what happened to Shadow after that." Abby and Jack exchanged glances. 8 months exactly when Shadow had appeared at their shelter. "Someone must have found him and dropped him here," Abby said. "No identification except a handwritten note with his name." Mason nodded, his expression grim. "Tom's sister lives in Idaho. She probably didn't know what to do with a working dog." He looked at Shadow with respect rather than pity. "This isn't a pet. This is a highly trained professional." "Well, this simplifies matters," Richard said briskly. "Mr. Cole can take the dog, and we can all move on. The euthanasia paperwork can be shredded." Shadow flinched at Richard's voice, moving closer to Mason. "There's something else you should know," Jack said, holding up the newspaper clipping. "Shadow was involved in the Granite Pass avalanche rescue. Wasn't he?" A shadow passed over Mason's face. "That was their last mission together. 7 people trapped. Shadow found 6 victims." His voice dropped. "But the 7th, a little girl named Lily Montgomery, was never recovered." Abby felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October air seeping through the old building's windows. "How old was she?" 8, Senator Montgomery's youngest daughter. They were skiing in a restricted area when the avalanche hit. Mason's hand stilled on Shadow's head. "Tom never accepted that we couldn't find her. He and Shadow kept going back to the site long after the official search was called off." "When exactly did the avalanche happen?" Jack asked, his former detective's instincts visibly awakening. "January 15th, around 3 a.m. Early snowmobilers triggered it in the dark." The kennel room fell silent. Even Richard seemed to grasp the significance. "Shadow howls every night," Abby said slowly. "Exactly at 3 a.m., never a minute before or after." Mason's expression shifted from confusion to dawning comprehension. "That can't be coincidence." "Tom's death," Jack pressed. "You're sure it was a heart attack?" Mason hesitated. "That was the official finding, but there were questions. He was found at his cabin with a note that just said, 'She's still out there.' The assumption was that he meant Lily, that he'd become obsessed." He looked down at Shadow with new understanding. Tom and Shadow were inseparable. If Tom found something before he died, then Shadow knows it too, Abby finished. Richard cleared his throat. "This is all very dramatic, but the shelter has practical concerns. Mr. Cole, will you be taking custody of the animal today?" Before Mason could answer, Shadow turned toward the shelter's eastern wall, the direction of Granite Pass, and let out a low, purposeful bark entirely different from his nightly howls. "I think," Mason said quietly, "Shadow still has a mission to complete." The small break room at Pine Ridge Shelter felt crowded with just the 4 of them. Shadow lay at Mason's feet, his eyes never leaving his former colleague's face. The transformation in the dog was remarkable, from the listless, haunted creature of this morning to this alert, focused professional. "Tell us everything about the avalanche," Abby said, pushing a mug of coffee across the table to Mason. "Leave nothing out." Mason wrapped his hands around the mug, the 1,000-yard stare of a man revisiting difficult memories settling across his features. It was supposed to be a private family skiing trip. The Montgomerys own a lodge near Granite Pass. Senator Robert Montgomery, his wife Eleanor, their 2 children James, 15 and Lily, 8 plus the senator's brother Edward and his wife Patricia. The 7th person was Peter Quinn. The family's security consultant. Restricted area, Jack noted. Why were they there? The senator claimed they were misled by a local guide, but that guide was never identified. Mason's jaw tightened. The avalanche hit at 3:07 a.m., according to Patricia Montgomery's emergency call. They were all asleep except for Peter Quinn, who was apparently checking the perimeter. Security seems excessive for a family ski trip, Jack observed, the former sheriff's instincts evident. The senator was considering a presidential run. Mason shrugged. Our team was called in at 4:30 a.m. Shadow and Tom were first on site by helicopter at dawn. Within 48 hours, Shadow had located 6 victims. The senator and his wife were found alive, though Eleanor lost her left leg below the knee. James Montgomery, Edward and Patricia Montgomery, and Peter Quinn were all recovered deceased. But not Lily, Abby said softly. Not Lily. Mason's voice grew rough. We searched for 3 weeks, used everything: ground-penetrating radar, thermal imaging, probe lines. The snow was over 20 feet deep in places. Shadow and Tom worked until they both collapsed from exhaustion most days. The room fell silent, save for the hum of the ancient refrigerator. Then what happened? Abby prompted. After 3 weeks. The search was officially called off. The girl was presumed dead, buried too deep or carried away by the slide into inaccessible terrain. Mason rubbed his face, but Tom wouldn't accept it. He took personal leave, kept going back with Shadow. At first, the team understood we've all lost people we couldn't save, but weeks turned to months. And the Montgomerys? Jack asked. They just accepted the search being called off. A darkness passed over Mason's face. That's where things get complicated, publicly. They thanked everyone for their efforts, privately. He hesitated. There were rumors that the senator pressured officials to end the search. He was gearing up for his campaign announcement. Having your daughter's body unfound was one thing, a tragedy. Having the media witness your ongoing grief was another. Richard, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, shifted in his chair. Surely you're not suggesting Senator Montgomery didn't want his daughter found? I'm saying priorities shifted, Mason replied carefully. Tom believed the search was called off prematurely. He became obsessed, started talking about anomalies in the search area, terrain features that shouldn't be there. And you think he found something? Abby pressed. Mason stared into his coffee. 6 months after the search ended, Tom asked me to meet him, said he had evidence, but wouldn't specify. I was deployed overseas before we could meet. When I returned 4 months ago, he was already dead. Heart attack. You said. Jack's tone made it clear he had doubts. That's what the coroner ruled. Tom was found in his cabin. No signs of struggle. But Mason lowered his voice. The note bothered me. She's still out there. Present tense. And Tom was in perfect health, former Army Ranger. Still ran 5 miles daily at 52. Shadow suddenly stood, moving to Mason's side and placing his head on the man's knee. The gesture seemed almost human in its comfort. There's more, Mason continued, absently stroking Shadow's ear. Tom's cabin had been cleared out, his research, maps, journals all gone. His sister said authorities told her they contained disturbing material that would only cause the Montgomerys more pain if made public. Authorities? Which authorities? Jack's eyes narrowed. She wasn't specific, just men in suits. After 20 years in law enforcement, you know that could mean anything from FBI to private security. Richard stood abruptly. This is all very interesting, but borders on conspiracy theory. The facts remain simple: a tragic avalanche, a missing child presumed dead, and a handler who couldn't accept failure. Then explain the howling, Abby challenged, her voice steady. Explain why a highly trained search dog, renowned for his discipline, would vocalize at exactly the same time each night, precisely when that avalanche struck. Richard had no answer for that. I want to take Shadow back to Granite Pass, Mason said. See how he reacts. If he's trying to tell us something, that's where we'll find answers. I'm going with you, Abby said immediately. So am I, Jack added. Richard's face reddened. Absolutely not, Abigail. You have responsibilities here. The board meeting is Friday, and we're discussing the shelter's financial future. Your job is already on thin ice after that incident with the pit bull adoption. You mean, when I approved a veteran adopting a therapy-trained dog instead of euthanizing it because of its breed? Abby stood her ground. That incident saved 2 lives. Richard, this is different. You're chasing ghosts based on a dog's behavior. No, Mason interrupted. She's trusting a professional search and rescue dog with thousands of hours of training and dozens of successful finds. Shadow isn't some pet having nightmares. He's trying to communicate the only way he can. Richard gathered his coat. I can't stop you from taking the dog, Mr. Cole. He legally belongs to your unit. But Abby and Jack are shelter employees, and I forbid this wild goose chase during work hours. I have 3 weeks of vacation saved, Abby said coldly. Use it, and I'll ensure the board reviews your position. We need practical leadership, not emotional crusades. After Richard stormed out, the 3 humans and Shadow sat in tense silence. He could make good on that threat, Jack warned Abby. The shelter's barely staying afloat. I know, Abby's eyes met Shadow's. But how do I ignore this, if there's even a chance? Mason pulled out his phone, showing them a photo of a smiling blonde girl missing her front teeth. This is Lily Montgomery, 2 years ago. Everyone gave up on her except Tom and Shadow. Now Tom is gone, and Shadow's still trying to complete his mission. Jack studied the newspaper clipping again. The Montgomery's lodge is about 3 hours from here. If we leave now, we can be at Granite Pass by nightfall. Richard was right about one thing, Abby said, standing to collect her coat. This isn't just about a dog howling. This is about what happened to Tom Miller. No dedicated handler dies leaving his partner behind without making arrangements. Something doesn't add up. If we do this, Mason cautioned, we're potentially antagonizing one of the most powerful families in the state. Senator Montgomery has friends in every level of government. Abby looked at Shadow, who had moved to the door, his posture alert, purposeful. I've got nothing to lose. Richards wanted me gone since I prioritized animal welfare over his precious budget. And I buried my daughter 5 years ago, Jack said quietly. If there's even a 1% chance that Lily Montgomery is alive, or that we can bring her home to her family for proper burial, I have to try. I couldn't find Claire in time. Maybe we can find Lily. As if understanding the gravity of their decision, Shadow let out a single, determined bark. I think that settles it, Mason said. Let's find out what Shadow's been trying to tell us for 8 months. The road to Granite Pass wound through dense pine forests that crowded against the asphalt like sentinels. Jack's old Ford pickup labored up the incline, its heater fighting a losing battle against the October chill. In the back seat, Shadow sat with military posture, his eyes fixed on the passing landscape with an intensity that hadn't been present in the shelter. "He knows where we're going," Mason observed, glancing over his shoulder. Abby nodded, watching the transformation with a mixture of hope and trepidation. Gone was the depressed, howling animal who had haunted Pine Ridge for 8 months. In his place sat a working dog, focused, alert, and unmistakably on duty. "There's the turnoff," Jack said, pointing to a narrow access road marked with a weathered sign, "Granite Pass Recreational Area, closed in winter." "It's not technically winter yet," Mason said with a grim smile. "But we're pushing our luck. First heavy snow and this road becomes impassable." The truck bounced along the deteriorating road, climbing higher into the mountains. The temperature dropped noticeably with each mile, and the shadows grew longer as the afternoon sun slipped behind jagged peaks. Finally, they reached a small clearing that served as a parking area. Beyond it, the land rose sharply toward the pass itself, a natural corridor between towering granite faces now partly obscured by low clouds. "This is where we set up base camp during the search," Mason explained, climbing out of the truck. "The avalanche zone is about a mile up that trail." The moment Shadow's paws touched the ground, his demeanor shifted again. His nose immediately went to work, sweeping the ground in methodical patterns. Every few steps, he would raise his head to test the air currents, then resume his ground search. "Is he tracking something specific?" Abby asked, pulling on her gloves against the biting cold. "He's working," Mason replied with quiet respect. This is what he was born to do. They gathered essential supplies, warm clothing, flashlights, first aid kit, water, and emergency rations. Jack added a satellite phone and a handgun, which he tucked into his jacket without comment. Shadow led them up the trail, his pace deliberate but urgent. The path grew steeper, narrower, the surrounding forest thicker. Without leaves, the aspens stood like pale ghosts among the dark pines. "The avalanche started up there," Mason pointed to a steep slope to their right. "Swept down through this entire drainage, almost half a mile wide at points." The scale was difficult to comprehend. 2 years of new growth and erosion had softened the boundaries, but the avalanche's path was still visible, a long scar of younger trees and different vegetation cutting through the older forest. "Where was the Montgomery Lodge?" Jack asked, surveying the terrain with a lawman's eye. "About 3/4 of a mile ahead. It was partly buried. They've since rebuilt it, further from the slide zone." Shadow had moved ahead, his nose working continuously. Suddenly, he stopped, turned sharply left, and began moving off the main trail. "Wait," Mason called. Frowning, "That's not right." The lodge was straight ahead. "Should we call him back?" Abby asked. "No." Mason's expression was thoughtful. "Shadow knows this area better than any of us. Let's see where he's going." They followed the German shepherd as he picked his way through undergrowth and overfallen logs, moving with the certainty of someone following a familiar path. After about 10 minutes, they emerged into a small clearing dominated by a massive old-growth pine. At its base was a crude stack of rocks clearly man-made. Mason approached it slowly, then knelt to examine the arrangement. "This isn't random. Someone built this." "A trail marker," Jack suggested. "Maybe." Mason carefully removed the top stones, revealing a waterproof container. Inside was a small notebook in a plastic bag. "Tom's handwriting," he confirmed, flipping through pages of notes and coordinates. "This is dated a year ago, 10 months after the avalanche." Abby moved closer. "What does it say?" "Day 113. Shadow alerted at new location 2.7 miles NEE of primary slide path. GPR showed anomaly, but team refused to investigate further, going back alone tomorrow." Mason looked up. "GPR is ground-penetrating radar. It's used to locate objects or structures beneath the surface." "He was still searching," Jack said quietly. Almost a year later. Shadow had continued moving, now pawing at a fallen log about 20 feet away. Mason quickly joined him, examining the area. "There's more," he called. Wrapped in waterproof material and tucked into the hollow log was a larger, more detailed journal, along with a handheld GPS unit and a small digital camera. "Tom left caches," Mason explained, his voice tight with emotion. "Standard procedure for long-term search operations in remote areas, but these weren't official. He was doing this on his own." As the afternoon light faded, they made the difficult decision to return to town. The mountains were no place to be caught unprepared after dark, especially with weather moving in. Shadow seemed reluctant to leave, but responded to Mason's commands. Back in Pinewood, they secured a room at the Pine Lodge Motel, a modest establishment that didn't ask questions when Shadow accompanied them inside. Spread across the bed were Tom's journals, maps, and the camera. "His entries get increasingly determined," Mason said diplomatically, paging through the journal. "At first, he's methodical, professional, documenting search areas, conditions, Shadow's responses. But around 6 months after the avalanche, the tone changes." "How so?" Abby asked, looking up from the map she was examining. "He becomes convinced the search was deliberately misdirected." "Listen to this, SM. Ordered team to focus south face despite Shadow's alerts to the north. Second time this has happened. Shadow never gives false alerts. Someone doesn't want us looking in that drainage." "M," Jack questioned. "Scott Miller. No relation to Tom. He was incident commander for the search." Jack's eyes narrowed. "And did Shadow typically alert to the north?" "I wasn't on every search day," Mason admitted. "But yes, I do remember Tom arguing that Shadow was consistently interested in the northern drainage, away from where the models predicted Lily would be found." Abby was studying a map where Tom had marked dozens of locations with different colored pins. "What do these colors mean?" Mason leaned over. "Red is where bodies were recovered. Blue is where Shadow alerted, but nothing was found. Green is—" He paused, consulting the journal. "Green is where Shadow gave his live-find signal, but was overruled or the area couldn't be searched due to conditions. There were 7 green pins, all clustered in an area well north of the main avalanche path." "That doesn't make sense," Mason muttered. "The slide went south. How would Lily have ended up north?" "Could she have been moved?" Jack asked, the detective in him emerging. "Before the avalanche? What are you suggesting?" "Just exploring all possibilities. If the girl wasn't in the lodge when the avalanche hit—" The implication hung in the air. too terrible to voice fully. "There's something else," Abby said, holding up the camera. "I've been going through the photos. Most are search documentation terrain features, potential access points. But these last ones—" She turned the camera's display toward them. The final series of photos showed a secluded area of forest with unusual rock formations. In one image, partially visible behind a fallen tree, was what appeared to be a small, weathered wooden structure. "That's not the Montgomery Lodge," Mason said immediately. "I've never seen that building before." "There's a date stamp," Jack noted. "March 15th? A year and a half ago? 2 months after the avalanche. And look at this one." Abby scrolled to the next image, which showed Shadow sitting alertly beside a narrow crevice in the rocks, his posture unmistakable to anyone familiar with search dogs. "That's his live find indication," Mason confirmed, his voice barely above a whisper. He believed someone alive was there. The next day, Tom reported chest pains and died in his cabin, Jack said grimly. "That timing doesn't strike anyone else as suspicious." Before they could discuss further, Abby's phone rang. It was Sarah Mitchell from the Pinewood Gazette, responding to a message Abby had left earlier. "Ms. Thornton, Sarah Mitchell returning your call. You said you had information about the Montgomery avalanche case." Abby hesitated, looking at Mason and Jack for guidance. Mason nodded slowly. "Yes," Abby said carefully. "We've discovered some new information that suggests the search for Lily Montgomery may have been incomplete." There was a pause on the line. "That's a significant claim," Sarah finally said. "Senator Montgomery is announcing his Presidential Exploratory Committee next month. Anything involving his family is extremely sensitive right now." "We understand the sensitivity," Abby replied. "But this isn't political. It's about a little girl who might not have been where everyone assumed she was during that avalanche." "I've covered the Montgomery family for years," Sarah said, her voice lowering. "There were irregularities in how that search was handled, things that didn't add up, but nobody would go on record. Would you be willing to meet with us? We have documents, photos." "Tonight," Sarah agreed. "Not at the office. The diner on Main. Back booth. 9 o'clock. The Pine Cone Diner was nearly empty when they arrived. Sarah Mitchell was already waiting, a sharp-eyed woman in her mid-30s with auburn hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She wore no press credentials, just a simple sweater and jeans, looking like any other local. After introductions and coffee orders, they showed her Tom's materials. "Tom Miller," Sarah mused. "I interviewed him several times during the search. He struck me as exceptionally dedicated, even by search and rescue standards. When he died, I tried to look into it, but the autopsy was rushed and the records sealed for family privacy. Sealed autopsy for a heart attack victim." Jack's eyebrows rose. Exactly my reaction. Sarah studied the map with its colored pins. "These northern alerts. This area is part of the old Granite Mining Company property, abandoned in the 80s. But there are still structures, mine entrances scattered throughout. Most aren't on public maps anymore." "Why would Shadow alert there if the avalanche went south?" Abby asked. Sarah hesitated. "What I'm about to tell you doesn't leave this table." She leaned forward. "The night of the avalanche, there was a 911 call from Patricia Montgomery at 3:07 a.m. Standard procedure. Right, but there was an earlier call at 2:18 a.m. from a satellite phone registered to Peter Quinn, the security consultant. What did the call say? Mason asked. That's just it. The call connected, but no one spoke. Dispatchers tried calling back. No answer. When the avalanche call came in later, no one connected the two until I started asking questions weeks later. By then, the recording of that first call had been accidentally deleted during system maintenance. So something might have been happening before the avalanche, Jack said thoughtfully. The Montgomerys weren't the perfect family their public image suggested. Sarah continued. Eleanor Montgomery had filed for divorce twice, withdrawing both times after private negotiations. James, the son, had been in rehab for cocaine addiction. And Lily... Sarah paused. Lily had recently begun telling her school counselor about scary men who visited their house at night. The implications settled heavily around the table. Are you suggesting Lily was in danger from someone in her family? Abby asked, her voice barely audible. I'm not suggesting anything specific, Sarah replied carefully. I'm saying there were complications in that family that never made the papers, and the search for Lily was called off with unusual haste. Despite Tom Miller's insistence that Shadow had detected signs of life, Shadow, who had been lying quietly under the table, suddenly sat up, his ears alert. Through the diner windows, they watched as a black SUV with tinted windows pulled into the parking lot. We should continue this elsewhere, Sarah said quickly, gathering her notes. Senator Montgomery has supporters everywhere in this town, including the sheriff's department. They slipped out the back just as two men in dark suits entered the diner. Back at the motel, Sarah helped them organize the information into a coherent timeline. If we go public with this, she warned, the blowback will be intense. Montgomery isn't just a senator, he's being groomed for higher office. His supporters will paint this as a political attack. This isn't about politics, Abby insisted. It's about Shadow's behavior and Tom's suspicious death. To you, yes, but perception matters. We need irrefutable evidence before making any accusations. We need to go back to where Tom took those final photos. Mason decided. Find that structure. See if Shadow alerts there again. The forecast calls for snow tomorrow, Jack noted, checking his weather app. If we're going back up the mountain, it needs to be first light. As they finalized plans for the morning, Abby's phone rang again. Richard Warner's name flashed on the screen. Abigail. His voice was cold when she answered. I've just received a disturbing call from Senator Montgomery's office. They say you're spreading rumors about the Granite Pass incident and harassing the family during their time of grief. That's not true. Richard, we're following leads about... I don't want to hear it. He cut her off. This ends now. Return to the shelter immediately or consider yourself terminated. And bring that dog back. He belongs with his unit. Actually, Mason interjected loudly enough to be heard, Shadow is legally under my authority, and I've determined he's needed for an ongoing investigation. Richard's voice rose. This is absurd. You're chasing conspiracies based on a dog's behavior. The board meeting is tomorrow, and I expect you there. Abigail, your position and the shelter's future funding depend on it. After he hung up, Abby stared at the phone. He mentioned the senator's office. How did they know what we're doing so quickly? Small town, Sarah suggested. Or someone at the diner recognized us. Or we're onto something they don't want found, Jack added grimly. That night, at exactly 3 a.m., Shadow stood at the motel window facing north toward Granite Pass and let out a single, purposeful howl different from his mournful shelter cries. This was the sound of a working dog, calling to be heard. "He's telling us she's still out there," Abby whispered. Morning brought heavy gray skies and a biting wind that promised snow by afternoon. They set out at dawn, this time following the coordinates from Tom's GPS unit to the location of his final photos. The terrain was challenging, steeper and more rugged than the main search area. Shadow led the way confidently, periodically looking back as if to ensure they were keeping up. "He's been here before," Mason observed. "Multiple times with Tom." After nearly 2 hours of hiking, they came upon the distinctive rock formation from Tom's photos. Shadow's demeanor intensified his movements, becoming more precise, his attention unwavering. "There," Jack pointed to a depression between two massive boulders. "That's where Shadow was sitting in the photo." The German Shepherd was already moving toward it, his body language shifting into what Mason called his work mode. Head low, tail straight, each step deliberate. "He's tracking," Mason explained quietly. "Let him work." They followed as Shadow led them through a narrow passage between rock faces, emerging into a small sheltered valley that had been invisible from the main trail. There, partially collapsed and covered with vegetation, stood the weathered wooden structure from Tom's photos, an old miner's cabin, long abandoned. Shadow approached it purposefully, circling once before sitting precisely at the door, the universal sign from a search dog that they've located a live person. "That's a trained alert," Mason confirmed, his voice tight. "He's indicating a live find." Jack drew his gun, approaching the cabin cautiously. "Hello? Anyone inside?" Silence answered him. The door hung askew on rusted hinges. Jack pushed it open with his foot, revealing a small, dust-filled interior, rotting furniture, broken glass, animal droppings, the typical remains of long abandonment. "No one's been here for years," Jack concluded after a careful sweep, but Shadow remained in alert position, unmoved. "He's not wrong," Mason insisted. "Shadow doesn't give false alerts." Abby moved closer, studying the cabin floor. "Look at this," she called, pointing to an area where the dust pattern was slightly different. "This section of flooring," Jack knelt beside her, "it's been moved recently." Together, they cleared away debris, revealing a trap door leading to what appeared to be an old root cellar or storage space beneath the cabin. "This could connect to the old mine tunnels," Sarah suggested. "This whole area is honeycombed with them." Shadow began pawing at the trap door, whining with increasing urgency. "Jack," Mason said quietly, "is your gun loaded?" Jack nodded, understanding the implication. If someone was down there, whether Lily Montgomery or someone who didn't want them finding her, they needed to be prepared. Mason lifted the trap door, revealing a set of crude wooden steps descending into darkness. Shadow moved to enter, but Mason held him back. "Not yet, boy. Let us check first." As Jack trained his flashlight into the opening, they could see that the small cellar opened into a wider tunnel, unmistakably part of the old mining operation. "There's a lantern here," Abby noted, finding an LED camping light just inside the entrance. "And these supplies don't look old." Indeed, the space contained modern emergency rations, water bottles, a sleeping bag, and a first aid kit. All showed signs of use. but none were decades old like the cabin itself. Tom found this place, Mason realized. He was using it as a secondary base for his continued searches. Jack's flashlight beam caught something else, a small, worn pink backpack pushed against the far wall. Sarah drew in a sharp breath. "That's Lily's. I've seen it in family photos." Shadow whined, pulling against Mason's restraining hand, desperate to move deeper into the tunnel. "We need to see where this leads," Mason decided. "But we should document everything first. Sarah, take photos of all of this exactly as we found it." As Sarah catalogued the scene, Abby examined the sleeping bag. "Someone's been using this regularly, and recently." "Tom," Jack suggested. "Tom died 8 months ago," Mason reminded him.
"This sleeping bag hasn't been collecting dust that long." The implication hung in the air between them. If not Tom, then who had been using this hidden shelter? And more importantly, was Lily Montgomery somehow connected to it, with Shadow leading the way? They prepared to follow the tunnel into the mountain's depths, not knowing that what they would discover would shake the foundations of everything they believed about the Granite Pass tragedy. The old mining tunnel stretched before them like a throat, swallowing their flashlight beams in its darkness. The air grew noticeably cooler as they descended, carrying the mineral tang of wet stone and the musty scent of earth long undisturbed. Shadow moved with absolute certainty, his nails clicking rhythmically against the stone floor. "These tunnels could go for miles," Sarah whispered, her voice echoing slightly despite her hushed tone. "The Granite Mining Company extracted over $2 million in silver before abandoning operations in 1983. "How stable are they?" Abby asked, eyeing the timber supports that occasionally buttressed the ceiling. "Depends on the section," Mason replied. The main extraction tunnels were well built, auxiliary passages less so. Shadow paused at a junction where the main tunnel split into 3 branches, his nose working the air currents. After a moment's consideration, he chose the rightmost passage without hesitation. "He's following something specific," Mason observed. "Not just exploring." The tunnel they entered was narrower, forcing them to proceed single file. Jack took the lead behind Shadow, his hand never straying far from his holstered gun. Mason followed, then Abby, with Sarah bringing up the rear, documenting their journey with occasional photographs. "Stop," Jack suddenly commanded, his voice low but urgent. "Listen." They froze, straining to hear past their own breathing and heartbeats. At first, there was nothing then, almost imperceptibly. A faint rhythmic sound carried through the stone corridor. "Water," Abby suggested. "No." Mason shook his head. "It's too regular." Shadow whined softly, pawing at the ground, eager to continue. They proceeded more cautiously now, every sense heightened. The tunnel gradually widened again, eventually opening into what had once been a larger excavation chamber. Ancient mining equipment lay scattered in rusted ore carts, pickaxes, the remnants of a mechanical winch system. This was a major operation point, Sarah noted, her reporter's instincts cataloging details. "But look, someone's been here recently." She pointed to a cleared area where the dust had been disturbed, creating a rough pathway through the chamber. Near the far wall, several modern items stood out against the antique mining equipment: a battery-powered lantern, a folding camp chair, and a small portable heater. "Tom's?" Jack questioned. "Maybe initially," Mason replied.
examining the items. But some of these things looked newer than that. Shadow had moved to the chamber's far side, where a narrow fissure in the rock wall created a natural doorway to another section. The dog sat in alert position, his eyes fixed on the opening, body trembling with restraint. "He's indicating again," Mason translated, his voice tight with anticipation. "Someone's through there." Jack drew his weapon. "Stay behind me!" The fissure was barely wide enough for an adult to pass through sideways. Jack went first, followed by Shadow once there was room. Mason helped Abby and Sarah navigate the tight passage, then squeezed through himself. They emerged into a space so unexpected it momentarily robbed them of words. The natural cave was roughly circular, perhaps 30 feet in diameter, with a ceiling that rose to a dome nearly 15 feet overhead. Unlike the manufactured tunnels, this chamber had been shaped by water over millennia, creating smooth, flowing contours in the rock. A narrow fissure in the ceiling allowed a thin shaft of natural light to penetrate the darkness, illuminating particles of dust that danced in the beam like miniature stars. But it was what human hands had added that rendered them speechless. The cave had been transformed into a crude living space. A foam sleeping pad covered with blankets occupied one corner. A plastic storage container served as both table and food storage. A 5-gallon water dispenser stood nearby. Battery-powered lanterns were positioned strategically around the space. Most striking were the walls. Every reachable surface had been covered with drawings, childish figures rendered in charcoal and colored pencils. Stick figure families holding hands, mountains with smiling suns overhead, animals that might have been dogs or wolves, and names written over and over in progressively improving handwriting: Lily, Tom, Shadow. Shadow moved directly to the sleeping pad and lay down. His posture relaxed for the first time since they'd entered the mountain. "My God," Sarah breathed. "Someone's been living here." "Not just someone," Mason said, his voice barely audible. "Lily Montgomery. She survived." Abby approached the sleeping area, noting the small size of the clothes folded neatly beside it. "These would fit a child, not an adult." "But they're not the clothes of an 8-year-old. They're bigger." "Because she's been growing," Jack realized. "If she survived the avalanche and somehow found shelter here, she'd be 10 now," Sarah finished, her reporter's mind calculating even as shock threatened to overwhelm her. Mason was examining a series of tally marks scratched into one wall, hundreds of them, arranged in groups of 7. "She's been counting days, almost 2 years' worth." "But how?" Abby struggled to comprehend the scenario unfolding before them. How could a child survive alone in a mountain cave for 2 years? Food, water, warmth, especially through the winters. "She wasn't alone," Mason said quietly, pointing to another wall covered with crude drawings of a man and a German shepherd. "Tom found her, and Shadow." The reality of what they were seeing began to take shape, a reality both miraculous and heartbreaking. "Tom must have found her months after the avalanche," Mason theorized, piecing together the evidence before them. "That's why he kept returning to this area despite everyone telling him it was impossible. Shadow was alerting because he knew she was here." "But why wouldn't Tom have reported finding her?" Sarah asked, the journalist in her immediately identifying the central question. Jack, who had been examining the cave's contents methodically, held up a waterproof notebook similar to the ones they'd found in Tom's caches. I think this might tell us. The journal was filled with Tom's increasingly frantic entries, dating back to 14 months ago. Listen to this. Jack read aloud. Day 247 after avalanche. Shadow finally led me to her. Alive. Alive. Hidden in an old mining ventilation shaft that opened into this cave system. She was nearly starved but had found water. Says she ran from the cabin before the snow came down. Says Uncle Edward told her to hide, that bad men were coming. When I told her about the avalanche, about her parents searching, she became hysterical. Said her father knew, that he had sent the bad men. I don't know what to believe, but I can't ignore a terrified child. The group exchanged stunned glances. Keep reading, Mason urged. Day 249. Called Montgomery Estate using satellite phone. Senator himself answered. Told him I found Lily alive. His response was not what I expected. No joy, no questions about her condition. Instead, he asked if anyone else knew where exactly she was located. Said to tell no one, that he would send a private medical team. Something felt wrong. When I mentioned Lily's fear, he hung up. An hour later, received call from Scott Miller ordering me to stand down, that a specialized team was taking over. No mention of Lily being found would be made public until she was safely extracted and examined. This feels wrong. Jack turned the page, continuing. Day 251. No medical team has arrived. Instead, observed unmarked helicopter surveying the area. Lily refuses to leave cave. Insists they will hurt her. I've brought her supplies. Established communication system. Will continue daily visits while figuring out next steps. The entries continued, documenting Tom's growing paranoia and determination to protect Lily while gathering evidence of whatever had frightened her so deeply. Day 312. Lily finally shared more details. Says she overheard Father and Uncle Edward arguing night before avalanche. Uncle said they had gone too far, that using children crossed a line. Father said it was necessary sacrifice for greater purpose. When Uncle threatened to expose everything, Senator said he would regret it. Lily believes avalanche was deliberate, meant to silence Edward. Cannot verify, but security consultant Quinn's presence and early satellite call raise questions. Sarah's face had gone pale. This aligns with rumors that circulated after Edward Montgomery's death. He was known to be the moral compass of the family, had recently been pushing back against some of the senator's more extreme political allies. If even half of this is true, Mason said grimly, it explains why Tom went underground with his discovery. He believed Lily was in danger from her own father. But why not go to the authorities? Abby asked. He tried. Jack continued reading. Day 340. Attempted to contact FBI with concerns. Was redirected to Special Agent Daltrey, who I later discovered is former private security for Montgomery family. Found listening device in my cabin afterward. No longer safe to use official channels. The final entries painted a picture of Tom's increasingly desperate situation. Day 402. Have established sustainable system for Lily. Cave maintains constant 52-degree temperature year-round due to geothermal activity. Water source is clean. I've installed basic ventilation system using mining shafts. Regular supply deliveries hidden as hiking trips. Shadow visits daily when I cannot. Lily is receiving basic education, growing stronger, but this cannot be permanent solution. The last entry was dated just 3 days before Tom's death. Day 443. Have compiled sufficient evidence to approach trusted journalist with story. Meeting Mason Cole next week when he returns from deployment. If anything happens to me, Shadow knows. Shadow always knows. He will never stop trying to bring help to Lily. Shadow, who had been lying quietly on the sleeping pad, suddenly raised his head, ears alert. A moment later, they all heard a faint scraping sound from somewhere in the tunnel system. "Someone's coming," Jack whispered, motioning them to extinguish their lights. In the near darkness, they pressed themselves against the cave walls. Shadow remained perfectly still, but his eyes were fixed on the fissure entrance. Minutes passed in tense silence before a beam of light appeared in the narrow opening, followed by a figure squeezing through, not an adult, but a small, thin child, dressed in layers of mismatched clothes. Lily Montgomery stood before them, her blonde hair cut unevenly, her face smudged with dirt, but unmistakably matching the photos they had seen. At 10 years old, she was small for her age, but stood with the wary confidence of someone who had survived the impossible. For a moment, she froze in terror at the sight of strangers in her sanctuary. Then Shadow bounded toward her with a joyful whine, and her fear transformed to disbelief, and then overwhelming joy. "Shadow!" she cried, throwing her arms around the dog's neck. "You came back! You brought help!" The reunion between child and dog was heartbreaking in its intensity. Shadow whined and licked her face while Lily sobbed into his fur, repeating his name like a prayer. When she finally looked up at the adults, her expression was cautious but hopeful. "Did Tom send you? Is he okay?" The devastating question hung in the air. Mason stepped forward, kneeling to her level. "My name is Mason Cole. I was Tom's friend. This is Abby, Jack, and Sarah. Shadow led us to you." "Where's Tom?" Lily asked, her voice small. "He promised he'd come yesterday, but he didn't. Shadow stopped coming too. I was so scared." Mason's voice gentled. "Lily, Tom died, honey, about 8 months ago, but Shadow never forgot you. He's been trying to bring someone to help you ever since." Lily's face crumpled, but she fought back her tears with the practiced control of a child who had faced too much hardship. "I knew something was wrong when he didn't come back, but I did what he taught me. Stay hidden. Trust Shadow." "You've been incredibly brave," Abby said, her heart breaking for this child who had survived alone in a cave while the world believed her dead. "But you're safe now. We're going to help you." Lily's expression suddenly hardened, a look no 10-year-old should know how to make. "Did my father send you?" The directness of the question stunned them. "No," Jack answered honestly. "Your father doesn't know we're here." Some of the tension left her small shoulders. "Good. Tom said I couldn't trust him, that he might have hurt Uncle Edward." "Lily," Sarah asked gently, "can you tell us what happened the night of the avalanche? Why were you in the mines instead of at the lodge?" The girl sat on her sleeping pad, one arm still wrapped around Shadow's neck like an anchor. "Uncle Edward woke me up, said I needed to hide. There were men coming who might hurt us." Her voice became distant, reciting a traumatic memory. He took me through a hidden door in the wine cellar. Said it was an old escape route from when the lodge was a mining office. Told me to run as far as I could, that he would find me in the morning. She drew a shaky breath. But then the mountain fell down. It was so loud. I was so scared I kept running deeper into the tunnels. I got lost. I couldn't find my way back. How did you survive those first months? Mason asked softly. There were emergency boxes in some tunnels, old food, blankets. I found water dripping in places. I was really hungry a lot. Her matter-of-fact description of near starvation was perhaps the most heartbreaking part. Then, one day, I heard barking. It was Shadow. He found me. Then, Tom came. The brutal simplicity of her survival story left them momentarily speechless. Why didn't Tom take you home? Sarah asked the question they were all thinking. Lily's eyes widened with renewed fear. I told him what I heard, about Daddy and Uncle Edward fighting, about the men coming that night. Tom called Daddy, but... She hugged Shadow tighter. Daddy didn't sound happy I was alive. Tom said something was wrong, that we needed to be careful. He made this place safe for me. Said he was gathering evidence so we could tell the world the truth. What truth? Lily, Jack asked gently. That Daddy and his friends do bad things. Uncle Edward was going to tell everyone. That's why they wanted to hurt him. Her child's understanding of adult corruption was both innocent and devastatingly accurate. Outside. The wind had picked up, whistling through the fissure in the ceiling. Shadow's ears suddenly pricked forward, and he stood, positioning himself protectively in front of Lily. What is it, boy? Mason asked, immediately alert to the dog's change in demeanor. A distant sound echoed through the cave system, the unmistakable thump of a helicopter approaching. Someone's coming, Jack said, moving to the fissure entrance to listen. Multiple voices in the main tunnel. Sarah checked her phone. No signal, but if someone traced our movements from town... We need to move, now, Mason decided. Lily, is there another way out of these caves? A back exit? The girl nodded. Tom showed me emergency routes. There's a small opening that leads to the other side of the ridge. But it's really tight. Only I can fit through it. That won't work for all of us, Jack said, his mind racing through options. We need to split up, get Lily to safety while creating a diversion. As the sounds of approaching searchers grew louder, they quickly formulated a desperate plan. Mason and Lily would use her escape route, taking Shadow and Tom's evidence with them. Jack would create a diversion in another section of the mine. Abby and Sarah would return the way they came, ready to confront whoever had followed them with just enough of the truth to buy time. If we don't all make it out, Mason said grimly, get to Sarah's editor with everything we've found. The world needs to know what happened here. Lily gathered her few precious possessions, Tom's journal, a small stuffed wolf that Shadow had carried to her months ago, and a locket containing a photo of her Uncle Edward. I'm scared, she admitted as Mason prepared to lead her through the narrow escape tunnel. I know, sweetheart, Abby said, quickly hugging the child. But Shadow will protect you. He's never stopped trying to save you. As if understanding his role, Shadow pressed against Lily's side, his eyes fixed on the path ahead. He always comes back for me, Lily said with simple faith. Even when Tom couldn't anymore. with a final look at the cave that had been both Lily's prison and salvation for 2 years. They separated, each group heading in different directions as the sounds of strangers invaded the mountain that had kept its secret for so long. The storm had arrived, snow beginning to fall in earnest outside. As Mason helped Lily into the narrow escape tunnel, he knew they were racing not just against whoever had followed them into the mountain, but against nature itself. Shadow led the way unhesitatingly, guiding them toward daylight and the culmination of his 8-month mission to bring help to the child he had never abandoned. The mountain had awakened, even deep within its stone heart. They could feel its restlessness, the subtle vibrations of heavy snow accumulating on unstable slopes, the whispering threat of another avalanche. Nature, it seemed, was conspiring with human pursuers to keep Lily's secret buried. Mason navigated the narrow escape tunnel, with Lily close behind him and Shadow bringing up the rear. The passage was barely wider than his shoulders in places, forcing him to turn sideways and inch forward. For Lily, who had used this route during Tom's emergency drills, it was easier, her small frame slipping through constrictions that made Mason hold his breath. "How much further?" he whispered over his shoulder, his voice tight from both the confined space and mounting tension. "There's a big rock that looks like a turtle," Lily replied. "Then 20 more steps to the outside." The tunnel grew colder as they neared the exit, the mountain's breath carrying the sharp scent of fresh snow. Mason's flashlight beam caught the turtle rock Lily had described, an oddly shaped boulder with a domed top and protruding formations that indeed resembled a reptilian head and legs. "Good girl," he encouraged. "Almost there." Behind them, Shadow's nails clicked rhythmically against stone, the sound occasionally punctuated by the dog's soft whines alerts that someone was following their trail. "They're getting closer," Mason translated grimly. As they reached the final stretch, a horrifying sound echoed through the mountain, a single gunshot, its report magnified and distorted by the tunnel system. "Jack," Mason breathed, thinking of their diversion plan. Lily's small hand found his in the darkness, squeezing with surprising strength. "Tom said never stop moving if you hear bad sounds. Keep going until you're safe." The wisdom Tom had instilled in this child during their months together had transformed her from victim to survivor. Mason squeezed her hand back, swallowing his fear for their companions. "That's exactly right. We keep moving." The exit, when they finally reached it, was little more than a jagged split in the rock face, partially concealed by scrub pine. Mason pushed aside branches crusted with fresh snow and peered out into swirling whiteness. The storm had intensified, visibility reduced to mere yards. The helicopter they'd heard earlier would be grounded in these conditions, a small mercy. "Wait," Mason cautioned, studying the pristine snow beyond their hiding place. "No tracks. We need to be careful." He pulled emergency foil blankets from his pack, wrapping one around Lily and using another to create makeshift snow covers for their boots. "We need to stay off the ridge," he explained. "Follow the tree line where we'll have cover." Shadow emerged from the tunnel, shaking stone dust from his coat. The transformation in the dog continued to amaze Mason. This was the elite search and rescue professional he remembered, not the depressed animal who had howled through shelter nights. Every sense was engaged, constantly evaluating their surroundings, protecting his charge. They set off through deepening snow, Lily between Mason and Shadow,
The visibility continued to worsen, the world narrowing to a bubble of white with occasional dark smudges of pine trees. Mason checked his GPS repeatedly, their blue dot creeping slowly toward the valley where Jack had parked the truck that morning a lifetime ago. "I'm cold," Lily admitted after nearly an hour of trudging through increasingly deep snow. Her small frame was beginning to shiver despite the emergency blanket. Mason knelt before her, his own exhaustion momentarily forgotten. "We need to keep your core temperature up. Climb on my back." He hoisted her into a piggyback position, her slight weight a reminder of how 2 years of cave living had affected her development. For a child who should have been growing rapidly between 8 and 10 years old, she seemed barely larger than she would have been at the time of her disappearance. "Shadow, lead," Mason commanded, knowing the dog's senses would be sharper than his own in the whiteout conditions. They had covered perhaps another half-mile when disaster struck. A section of snow-covered ground gave way beneath Mason's right foot, plunging his leg knee-deep into a hidden crevice. The sudden drop sent him lurching forward, barely managing to twist his body to avoid crushing Lily beneath him as they fell. Pain exploded in his ankle and lower leg, accompanied by the unmistakable grinding sensation of bone against bone. Mason bit back a scream, aware of Lily's frightened eyes upon him. "I'm okay," he lied through gritted teeth. "Just a little stuck." But as he attempted to extract his leg, the true severity became apparent. His ankle was clearly broken, possibly his tibia as well, and each movement sent waves of nauseating pain up his leg. Shadow circled them anxiously, whining as he sensed Mason's distress. "Mason," Lily's voice trembled. "You're hurt bad, aren't you?" He couldn't lie to this child who had endured so much. "Yes, honey. I think my leg is broken." The realization of their situation settled over them like the relentlessly falling snow. They were miles from safety, in whiteout conditions, with unknown pursuers behind them and a severely injured adult. Even the truck, if they could reach it, might be buried under snow by now. Lily's face underwent a remarkable transformation, fear giving way to determination. "Tom showed me what to do for injuries. We need to stabilize your leg." With a competence that no 10-year-old should possess, she helped Mason extract his leg and used branches and strips torn from the emergency blanket to create a crude splint. Her small fingers worked deftly despite the cold. The techniques clearly practiced during her long months of survival training with Tom. "You're doing great," Mason encouraged, fighting waves of pain and the encroaching edges of shock. "Perfect rescue technique." When the splint was secure, the brutal truth remained. Mason couldn't walk, and they couldn't stay where they were without risking hypothermia. "Lily," Mason said, making the most difficult decision of his career, "you and Shadow need to continue without me." Her eyes widened in protest. "No, Tom said never leave anyone behind." "This is different," Mason explained gently. "I'll only slow you down, and we need to get you to safety. Shadow can lead you to the road. Remember the plan, find Sarah's editor in Pinewood?" "But the bad men, they're following our trail, which means they'll find me first. That gives you time." Mason reached into his pocket, removing Tom's journal and the small waterproof camera. "Take these. They're the evidence Tom collected. Get them to people who can help." Tears froze on Lily's cheeks. "I can't leave you." Mason gripped her shoulders. "Listen to me, Lily.
Shadow has been trying for 8 months to complete his mission to bring you home safely. Help him finish what he started." Shadow moved between them, his intelligent eyes shifting from Mason to Lily. Even without words, his intention was clear: he would protect the child. Mason unclipped his satellite phone, pressing it into Lily's gloved hand. "Once you reach the valley, the signal should work. Call this number. It's my unit commander. Tell him everything." With a soldier's efficiency, Mason created a sheltered space for himself beneath an overhanging rock, insulated with pine boughs. He would survive for hours, perhaps longer if the snow provided insulation rather than wet cold. "Go," he urged, when Lily still hesitated. "This is what Tom prepared you for. This is why Shadow never stopped howling." With a final, wrenching embrace, Lily pressed her face into Mason's shoulder. "I'll send help. I promise." "I know you will," Mason replied, his voice steady despite the pain and encroaching cold. "You're the bravest person I've ever met." As Shadow led Lily away into the swirling white, Mason watched until they disappeared from view. Then, alone in the growing darkness, he began the long battle against pain, cold, and the knowledge that their pursuers would likely find him before any rescue could arrive. Abby and Sarah pressed themselves into a shallow recess in the tunnel wall, barely breathing as 4 men in tactical gear moved past them. The men carried professional-grade equipment, high-powered flashlights, climbing gear, and most alarmingly, weapons partially concealed beneath their winter parkas. "Private security," Sarah mouthed silently when the footsteps faded. "Not police." They waited another minute before continuing in the opposite direction, toward the main chamber. Their original plan to exit the way they'd entered had been compromised when they'd glimpsed the first team entering that passage. Now, they were improvising. Following a secondary tunnel Jack had identified during their initial exploration. "Do you think that gunshot was Jack?" Abby whispered, her voice barely audible. Sarah's face was grim in the dim light of their single flashlight. "I don't know, but his diversion seems to be working. Most of them headed that way." The tunnel narrowed, then widened again as they entered a chamber they hadn't seen before. Ancient mining equipment lay scattered about, thick with dust except for a narrow path that showed recent disturbance. "Someone's been through here," Abby noted, pointing to clear boot prints in the dust. "Tom, probably. Look." Sarah indicated a small stack of supplies tucked behind a rusted ore cart, emergency rations, water, a first aid kit, another of Tom's caches. They quickly rifled through it, finding another notebook wrapped in plastic. Unlike the detailed journals they'd discovered earlier, this one contained only coordinates and cryptic notations. "We need to take this," Sarah decided, tucking it into her jacket. "Everything Tom left behind is evidence now." They continued forward, the tunnel gradually sloping upward, suggesting it might lead to the surface. Hope flickered briefly, then died as they rounded a bend and found their path blocked by a cave-in. Massive boulders and debris completely sealed the passage. "Recent?" Abby observed, noting the fresh rock dust still hanging in the air. "Could have been triggered by the helicopter vibrations." Sarah leaned against the tunnel wall, exhaustion evident in every line of her body. "Now what? We can't go back toward those men, and we can't go forward." Abby closed her eyes, forcing herself to think. There was another branch, about 50 yards back, We passed it on the right. The side passage proved narrower and rougher than the main tunnel, clearly not part of the original mine operations. They had to proceed single file, ducking in places where the ceiling dipped alarmingly low. "Stop," Abby suddenly whispered, holding up a hand. "Listen." A faint sound carried through the rock, not human footsteps, but the unmistakable rhythm of water. Following the sound, they emerged into a natural cavern where a small underground stream flowed across their path before disappearing into the rock wall. "Water means a way out," Abby said, hope returning. "It has to come from somewhere and go somewhere." They followed the stream's path, their progress slow on the slick stone. The water deepened from ankle to mid-calf, the cold seeping through their boots and chilling them to the bone. Just as Abby began to question her logic, the passage widened dramatically, and a faint grayish light appeared ahead. "Daylight," Sarah breathed. They emerged onto a narrow ledge overlooking a steep ravine. Snow fell heavily around them, the storm having intensified during their hours underground. Visibility was minimal, the landscape transformed into a disorienting white void. "Where are we?" Sarah asked, shouting to be heard over the wind that whipped across the exposed ledge. Abby checked her compass. "Eastern side of the ridge, I think." "The truck is north from here, maybe 2 miles. The descent from their perch proved treacherous. The narrow game trail that led down from the mine opening was barely visible beneath the fresh snow, and the rocks were slick with ice. Twice Sarah nearly fell, saved only by Abby's quick reflexes. By the time they reached the ravine floor, both women were soaked with snow and sweat, their reserves of strength nearly depleted. The storm showed no signs of abating, if anything. It had intensified, the wind driving snow horizontally into their faces. "We need shelter," Abby decided, scanning the base of the cliff. "We can't make it to the truck in these conditions." They found a slight overhang that offered minimal protection from the driving snow. Using the emergency blanket from Abby's pack, they created a makeshift lean-to, huddling together for warmth. "Do you think Lily and Mason made it out?" Sarah asked, her teeth chattering. "Shadow would have led them to safety," Abby replied with more confidence than she felt. "That dog has been trying to save her for 8 months. He won't fail now." As they waited for the storm to ease, Sarah removed Tom's notebook from her jacket, studying the cryptic entries. "These coordinates," she said suddenly, "they're not just random locations. Look at the pattern." The notebook pages showed a methodical grid of the mountain, with dates and notations at specific intersections. Some were marked with a simple X, others with S+ or S, shadow positive or negative. Abby realized he was mapping every place Shadow alerted. And these dates, Sarah pointed to a sequence that showed increasing frequency. He was narrowing it down, getting closer to finding Lily. Sarah flipped to the final pages, where the methodical grid gave way to frantic notes. "Listen to this. Quinn's satellite phone record shows call at 2:18 a.m. 49 minutes before avalanche. Montgomery campaign received $10 donation next day from Shell Company. Edward threatened exposure. Not coincidence." Abby's blood ran cold. "He's suggesting the avalanche was deliberate," Sarah finished. "A staged accident to silence Edward Montgomery and cover up something else. Something big enough to kill for." But what could justify, Abby began, then froze as a sound carried through the storm, the mechanical whump of helicopter blades, somehow still flying despite the dangerous conditions. They pressed deeper under their makeshift shelter, watching as a black helicopter appeared through the snow, hovering over the mountain face where they had emerged. A spotlight swept the cliffside methodically. "They're not giving up," Sarah whispered. "Whatever they're hiding, it's worth risking lives in this storm." The helicopter continued its search pattern for several minutes before banking sharply and disappearing into the whiteout conditions. The moment it vanished, Abby made a decision. "We need to move now, while they're searching elsewhere. The truck is our best chance." Gathering their meager supplies, they set off into the storm, using Abby's compass to maintain their northward bearing. The going was brutal knee-deep snow in places, wind that cut through their wet clothing like knives, visibility that extended barely 10 feet ahead. They had covered perhaps half a mile when Sarah stumbled, falling heavily into the snow. When Abby helped her up, she noticed the reporter's face was alarmingly pale, her lips tinged with blue. "Hypothermia," Abby diagnosed, her nurse's training taking over. "We need to find shelter now." But the landscape offered nothing. No trees large enough to block the wind, no rock formations that might provide a haven, just endless white, broken occasionally by the dark shapes of scrub pine too small to offer protection. "There," Sarah pointed with a trembling hand. "Is that—" A dark shape loomed ahead, gradually resolving into the outline of a vehicle partially buried in drifting snow. Not Jack's truck, but a large SUV with tinted windows identical to the one they'd seen outside the diner. "It's them?" Abby whispered. "The men following us?" "No," Sarah replied, her voice weak but certain. "Look." The vehicle sat empty, its hood already accumulating snow. No tracks led away from it. Whoever had driven it there had been gone for some time. They must have parked and entered the mine system from another entrance, Abby reasoned. "Which means—" "It has keys," Sarah finished, "and a heater." The SUV was indeed unlocked, the keys in the ignition, typical in remote areas where theft was virtually non-existent, and the greater danger was being stranded without access to shelter. The interior was luxurious leather seats, advanced electronics, and most importantly, a powerful heating system that sprang to life when Abby turned the key. As warmth flooded the vehicle, they discovered something else, a laptop computer secured to a mount between the front seats, its screen showing a topographical map of Granite Pass with multiple locations marked. "They've been monitoring the entire area," Sarah observed, her journalistic instincts overriding even her physical distress. "Look at this." The map showed not only the terrain but also the locations of cameras and motion sensors placed strategically throughout the mountain. "They've had this place under surveillance for months," Abby realized. "Ever since Tom died." Sarah tapped at the keyboard, bypassing the login screen with surprising ease. Basic security protocol, most people use predictable passwords, and the files she accessed confirmed their worst fears. Surveillance logs dating back months, reports on Target T, clearly Tom, and Subject L, Lily, and most damning, communications with Client RM that explicitly ordered containment of the situation by any means necessary. "Robert Montgomery," Sarah translated grimly. "The senator hired these people to find his daughter, not to rescue her, but to ensure she never tells her story." Abby stared at the evidence in horror. A sitting U.S. senator arranged the death of his own brother, then spent 2 years hunting down his traumatized daughter to silence her. Politics is brutal, Sarah replied, quickly copying files to a thumb drive she pulled from her pocket. But this goes beyond politics. The references to the project and necessary sacrifices, this is something bigger. And a final file contained what appeared to be a contingency plan, detailed instructions for staging an unfortunate secondary avalanche incident should Subject L be located with witnesses present. They're planning to trigger another slide, Abby realized with growing horror. To bury everyone involved, including us. And make it look like a natural disaster, Sarah added, her fingers flying across the keyboard. Perfect cover. Everyone knows this area is avalanche-prone. The laptop suddenly chimed, a message appearing on screen. Team Alpha, report status. Extraction vehicle approaching your location. Sarah quickly closed the files. We need to move, now. But as they prepared to abandon the SUV, Abby's gaze caught something outside, a flash of movement in the swirling snow. She lowered the window slightly, listening. The sound came again, not the mechanical noise of approaching vehicles or the voices of men, but a familiar purposeful bark that cut through the howling wind. Shadow, Abby breathed, hope surging through her exhausted body. He's found us. Shadow emerged from the whiteout like a ghost, snow crusting his dark fur. Behind him, barely visible, trudged a small figure bundled in layers of emergency blankets and oversized clothing. Lily's face was nearly hidden beneath a makeshift hood, but her eyes widened with recognition when she spotted Abby through the SUV's window. Abby flung open the door, the bitter cold rushing in as she reached for the child. Lily, thank God. The girl stumbled forward into Abby's arms, her small body trembling with cold and exhaustion. Shadow pressed against them both, his mission to deliver his charge safely accomplished at last. Mason's hurt, Lily said immediately, her voice weak but urgent. His leg is broken. He made us leave him so I could get help. Sarah moved to the driver's seat, already turning the SUV around. Where, how far back? By the big fallen tree, where the ground drops away, Lily explained, her teeth chattering as Abby wrapped her in a dry blanket from the SUV's emergency kit. Shadow knows, but there are bad men in the mountain. They shot at us. We know, sweetheart, Abby soothed, helping the child into the back seat. You're safe now. No. Lily's voice was suddenly older, harder, the voice of a child who had survived the unthinkable. Nobody's safe. My father sent them, just like he sent them for Uncle Edward. Shadow jumped into the vehicle without invitation, positioning himself protectively beside Lily. The intelligence in his eyes was unmistakable. His mission wasn't complete until everyone was safe. He can find Mason, Abby said to Sarah, but we need to be careful. There are men with guns up there, and according to what we found on this computer, they're planning to trigger another avalanche to cover their tracks. Sarah's hands tightened on the steering wheel. What about Jack? Any sign of him? Lily shook her head, her matted blonde hair falling across her face. Mason said the gunshot we heard might have been him. The SUV's tires spun in the deep snow before finding purchase. Sarah navigated carefully through the whiteout conditions. Following Shadow's agitated directions, a system of barks and physical indications that seemed almost supernatural in their precision. There, Lily suddenly pointed. Behind those trees. In the shelter of a massive fallen pine, they found Mason semi-conscious, his face gray with pain and cold. Despite his condition, his hand moved immediately to where his weapon would be when the SUV's headlights illuminated his position. "It's us!" Abby called, rushing to his side while Sarah kept the engine running. "Mason, we're getting you out of here." His eyes focused slowly. "Lily, she made it. She's safe. You did good." Abby quickly assessed his injury, a compound fracture of the tibia, the bone visibly deformed beneath his ski pants. "This is going to hurt. But we need to move you now." With Sarah's help, they half-carried, half-dragged Mason to the SUV, his jaw clenched against the agony of movement. Once inside, Abby administered emergency first aid, stabilizing the leg as best she could with the limited supplies available. "Jack?" Mason asked through gritted teeth as Sarah navigated the SUV back toward the main road. "No sign," Sarah replied grimly. "But we found something else. The men hunting us, they're private security hired by Senator Montgomery. They've been monitoring these mountains for months, looking for Lily." "Not to rescue her," Abby added, glancing at Lily, who sat silently stroking Shadow's fur. "To silence her." Mason absorbed this, his tactical mind still functioning despite his injury. "The truck is probably watched. We can't go back that way." "I know a back road," Sarah decided. "It adds an hour, but it bypasses the main access points." As they drove, Lily gradually revealed more of her story, how Tom had visited her almost daily, bringing supplies, teaching her survival skills, recording her account of what she had overheard between her father and uncle, how Shadow had become her constant companion whenever Tom couldn't be there. "Tom said he needed proof before we could tell everyone the truth," she explained. "He was collecting evidence about my father's secret meetings and the money that came afterward. He called it the Sacrifice Project because that's what Uncle Edward said they were doing, sacrificing people." The innocence with which she relayed these horrors made them all the more disturbing. This child had carried the burden of terrible knowledge for 2 years, alone in a mountain cave with only a dedicated handler and his dog for support. "Tom believed your uncle was going to expose whatever your father was involved in," Sarah gently prompted. "And that's why the avalanche happened that night." Lily nodded, her small face solemn. "Uncle Edward told Daddy he was going to tell everyone, even if it meant Daddy went to jail. He said using children wasn't right, no matter what. Daddy said it was for the greater good." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "The next morning, the mountain fell down." Shadow pressed closer to her, his warmth and presence visibly calming the child. "What happened to Jack?" Mason asked, wincing as the SUV hit a rough patch. "He created a diversion," Abby explained. "Led the security team away from Lily's escape route. We heard a gunshot." The implication hung heavily in the air. "We need to get this evidence to the authorities," Sarah said, her reporter's instincts focusing on the practical. "The thumb drive, Tom's journals, Lily's testimony, it's enough to launch an investigation." "Not local authorities," Mason cautioned. "Montgomery has influence everywhere in this state. We need federal intervention, someone completely outside his sphere. First, we need to get Mason to a hospital and Lily to safety," Abby insisted. "Everything else comes after that." As they debated their next steps, Lily suddenly sat up straighter, her eyes wide. "Stop the car!" Sarah immediately braked. the SUV sliding slightly on the snow-covered road. "What is it?" "Look!" Lily pointed through the windshield, where the headlights had caught a dark figure trudging through the snow ahead. Jack Reynolds, his coat torn and bloodied, but unmistakably alive. The reunion was brief but emotional. Jack collapsed into the SUV. Exhaustion etched in every line of his weathered face. A bullet had grazed his arm. Painful, but not life-threatening. "They've got the mountain surrounded," he reported between gulps of water. "I overheard their communications. They're planning to sanitize the area once they confirm Lily's location." "The avalanche." Abby nodded grimly. "We saw the plans on their computer." "We need to get ahead of this," Sarah decided, accelerating carefully down the mountain road. "Once we reach cell coverage, I'm calling my editor. This story breaks tonight, with or without official cooperation." As the SUV descended toward the valley, the storm began to ease, patches of clear sky appearing between clouds. In the back seat, Lily had finally succumbed to exhaustion, her small body curled against Shadow's protective warmth, her first real sleep in safety for over 2 years. Abby watched the child and dog, her heart breaking and healing simultaneously. "He never gave up," she whispered. "Every night at 3 a.m., he was trying to tell us she was still out there." "Some bonds can't be broken," Jack replied softly, his own thoughts clearly with his lost daughter. "Not by time, not by distance, not even by death." The lights of Pinewood appeared in the valley below, and with them the promise of justice long delayed but finally within reach. As they descended toward civilization, all of them understood that the real battle, the fight to protect Lily and expose the truth, was just beginning. But for this moment, as Shadow maintained his vigilant watch over the sleeping child he had never abandoned, there was a sense of completion, a mission fulfilled against impossible odds by a loyalty too profound for words. In a world that often forgets the value of unwavering commitment, Shadow's story reminds us of what truly matters. For 8 long months, this loyal German shepherd howled at precisely 3 a.m., not from madness or grief, but from an unbreakable promise to a lost child who still needed him. While modern society rushed to label him unadoptable, Shadow was actually demonstrating the kind of steadfast devotion our generation once held sacred. His story speaks to all of us who felt discarded or dismissed in our later years. When our wisdom is labeled as outdated and our persistence as stubbornness, like Shadow, many of us know what it means to keep faith when everyone else has moved on, whether waiting for an estranged child to call, holding space for a spouse battling illness, or maintaining hope when doctors and experts have given up. Sometimes the deepest wisdom comes not from credentials or technology, but from the heart's quiet certainty that someone still needs us. Shadow's legacy isn't just about saving Lily. It's about honoring that still small voice inside that says, "Don't give up, keep howling. Someone will eventually hear." In our twilight years, perhaps that's the most important lesson of all.